Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Sam, and I'm going to be hosting the call tonight. Thank you very much for joining. Like I said, I'm Sam Coates. I am the campaigns officer here at Unlock Democracy, and I'll be running us through proceedings this evening. So we have with us tonight Minnie Rahman from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, who I'll introduce properly shortly. But before that, there's a few things I want to go through. So firstly, welcome. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you're calling in from, what's brought you here tonight, and what you're hoping to learn about. We're trying to have a conversation here. So if you're new to Unlock Democracy, I'll just give you a quick rundown of what we're about. So we think that at the root of many of the crises that have been developing and intensifying over the years is the reality that there's too much political power concentrated in too few hands, and that's something that needs to change. So we're campaigning for a better democracy, and we believe that has to be underpinned by a deliberative process that the public are involved in, that ultimately leads to designing a new codified constitution that protects all of our rights and protects our ability to take part in the political system. So before we go any further, a little bit of housekeeping. I just want to let you know that the session is being recorded, so others have the benefit of looking at it later on. So please take that into account if you're using the chat, for example, but the breakout groups will not be recorded. So don't worry about your face being recorded in too big resolution, for example. So we'll be having a Q&A, obviously. So as Minnie is speaking, please do put your questions in the chat, which means that we can make it run smoothly once we move into the Q&A. I will be picking out questions that people post and trying to arrange them into some common themes so that as many people as possible can have their points addressed. So I also want to say that this is a conversation. We all want to be nice to each other here, and we've made these meetings very open, allowing almost anyone to join in. But that does mean that I need to point out that we want to keep the discussion civil and respectful, and I don't want to see any kind of dehumanizing language or bigotry or prejudice of any kind. So we've got that out of the way. So I'm just going to go through the agenda for this evening. So Minnie is going to kick us off shortly by talking for about 15 minutes. Like I said. After that point, we will have the Q&A. And like I said, please use the opportunity whilst she's speaking to put your questions into the chat box. After that point, we'll be having a Q&A session where, after the Q&A, we will be going into breakout groups. So this is something that's a bit experimental, but it worked well in the session that we had last night. So we will be putting you into small groups where you can reflect on the talk that we've just heard and for people to have a conversation about the implications of it. So to set the scene then, the lockdown that we're in at the moment is raising really big questions about what democracy is going to be like in the future and what direction that could go in. So the situation we're in now is one where multiple crises have emerged and got worse. So perhaps we could go first with the 2008 financial crisis, which has led to increased levels of inequality, increased levels of poverty, an erosion of the safety net, along with the rise of more pernicious things like the hostile environment, which is something we'll be talking about this evening. But what exactly does this have to do with democracy, we might ask? Well, last night we kicked off with a session about the war on democracy to really look at the history of the ways in which that the most powerful people have been trying to close the boundaries of what counts for democracy and really giving more and more power to the people that already have lots of power, financial or political. And really, we're talking about these issues because they're really closely linked to democracy, and it's really obvious in the case of migrant communities where if you don't have citizenship, if you don't have the right to vote, your ability to take part in politics, in democracy is really limited, and there's no one that's necessarily going to speak for you. And that's really important at the moment where we're seeing the increased level of government interference in our lives. It's an unprecedented level of power that they have in peacetime. And, you know, before this all kicked off, in terms of the coronavirus crisis, there were plans in the works for bringing in voter ID, We know that affects certain communities more than others. We were looking at the possibility of judicial review being reviewed, which is one of the only ways you have to assert your rights if you don't have a direct say in democracy itself. And there was also talk of reviewing the Human Rights Act. These were all things that were in the government's manifesto and all things that have an impact on migrant communities disproportionately. So before we hand over to Minnie to start talking, I want to run a little poll to get a sense of where people are feeling about this issue. So Trudy's going to open the poll. She has opened it, in fact. So we're asking the question, will the pandemic shift attitudes towards migrant communities for the better? And the possible answers there are yes, I think they will. No, I think they could get worse. I think they'll stay about the same, or I'm unsure. So obviously we've seen changes with lots of debate about the Nhs Surcharge, for example, in the past few weeks. Really keen to hear what people think about that. We'll give you another few seconds to vote in that and see what the results are. So almost everyone has now voted, so I think we're able to close the poll. So we can see there that it's not an agreement by any means. People are quite split on it. So 35% of you think attitudes will improve, but more, 46% say that they could get worse. So that's a really interesting thing that I think people will explore in the breakout groups later on. So I'll now in a moment hand over to Minnie Rahman. I'll just say a bit about her first. She is a writer, a speaker, and the public affairs and campaigns manager for the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. She's been involved in campaigning against the hostile environment for a long time, has particularly been involved in the challenge of the government's right to rent policy, which means that people have to basically prove their right to live in the UK in order to rent housing. And it's also been campaigning on the government's immigration bill in recent weeks, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot about now. She's also been published in outlets like Red Pepper and The Independent. But I think that's enough from me, quite enough from me. So I'll hand over to Minnie now to kick us off for the evening.
Thanks. I think I'm unmuted now. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the introduction, Sam. As Sam mentioned there, I work for an organisation called the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. So we are one of the oldest migrants' rights charities in the country. We are also a law firm, so we have clients from across the immigration system. So that's everyone from people who have been undocumented for many, many years, to asylum seekers, to children in care, and to people in prison. We use the experience of our clients and conversations with our clients to campaign for better rights for migrants. So I think for those of us sort of in the migrants' rights movement currently, the pandemic has sort of really highlighted the inadequacies in our migration system, of which there are many, and it's often really complicated to work out where to start. But I think what this sort of moment in time has done for us is bring to the forefront what really needs to change for migrant communities in order to ensure that they're safe and can access vital services and can protect themselves from something like coronavirus. And, you know, as we sort of take the opportunity to think about how the government is going to restart the economy and look at what we've learned from the crisis, we have to think about how we can ensure that migrants' rights are placed at the centre of economic and social recovery and as Sam said, democracy. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what kinds of problems that migrants have been experiencing currently and what we can ask for as a result of those experiences. So there have been wide-ranging and significant problems in things like detention centres, which are overcrowded and obviously indefinite people can be in there indefinitely. The government has not released everyone from detention, which has happened in lots of other European countries, and that's really significant for migrants who, you know, may be trapped in bad accommodation and housed in a bad accommodation and at high risk of contracting coronavirus. Similarly, housing conditions for asylum seekers are chaotic and bad, and most people are housed in very shoddy accommodation. The government hasn't really done very much for those people either. And then there are general problems with people's visas, you know, people being forced to stay in the country and their visas overrunning and therefore then becoming undocumented, or having to renew their visa and not being able to get to court or to the Home Office and being worried about what happens to their status. Those are just generally part and parcel of a chaotic Home Office, which doesn't really value migrants or migrant communities. But I think for JCWI and for me, what has been the biggest challenge so far for migrant communities has been the hostile environment, with the effects most acute for undocumented migrants. So for those of you who don't know the detail, the hostile environment is a set of policies that was introduced by Theresa May in 2012. What that set of policies does is stop people without the right documentation from being able to access pretty much every public service and more. So it's you have no recourse to public funds, which means no benefits, no welfare. You can't access housing if you don't have the right documentation. You can't work if you don't have the right documentation. And there are criminal offences and criminal fines for either employing someone or renting a house to someone who doesn't have the right document. And basically, border enforcement has been outsourced to the public. And not only that, but the policies have been proven to cause racial discrimination for British citizens as well as migrant communities. So JCWI has worked really proactively on the right to rent policy, which, as Sam mentioned, is the policy which means landlords have to check that their tenants have the right documentation. And what we have found in our research, and we also took the government to court and won in High Court, is that what landlords will often do is look at that piece of paper with a list of names on for people who want to rent their property and say, oh, well, that person has a foreign sounding name, I'm not going to rent to them because I might get fined, and therefore pushing migrants and people of colour into more difficult housing conditions, making the housing market much smaller for them. So, you know, that's across the board with the hostile environment in general, but those are some of the main problems with it. What the hostile environment does is it makes people afraid of seeking medical treatment. If you don't have recourse to public funds, it pushes you into exploitative working, puts you in a really vulnerable and dangerous position. And during coronavirus, what that has meant for undocumented migrants is that they've been unable to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy, and in many cases have been disproportionately exposed to the virus. For example, we don't really see public conversation about the fact that undocumented migrants have been forced to continue unpaid work or exploitative work as carers or cleaners or nannies or even security guards, and don't have any rights to access support should they need it. That is also across the board for lots of migrants and lots of different migrant groups, but that's the group we're currently most concerned about in terms of being able to have the right support services. And the biggest part of the hostile environment that we've been worried about is access to healthcare for migrants in general. So part of the hostile environment was to introduce significant healthcare charges for people who don't have the right documents. So firstly, you could be charged up to 150% of the price of a treatment if you decide, if the Home Office and the NHS decide that you don't have a right to healthcare. We've seen lots of cases of people, for example, who've needed heart surgery and been charged £100,000, which is an impossible fee. And not only that, if you do access treatment, the data sharing between the Home Office and the NHS could be used as a reason to deport you or to raise a problem with your migration status. So in normal times, that's bad enough, even when there are exemptions for specific diseases or viruses, and there is an exemption for coronavirus, but it's sort of besides the point, because having the policy in place in the first place stops people from accessing healthcare even when they need it and have a right to it. So, for example, just for comparison, tuberculosis, which is a similarly infectious disease, there's an exemption for it, but all the evidence has shown over the last few years that when people think they have tuberculosis but have a concern about their migration status or don't understand the regulations because they're extremely complicated, they don't come forward for treatment. And during the pandemic, there have been many cases and examples of migrants being able to come forward for healthcare, which obviously puts them at high risk of dying during the pandemic. The Home Office has also refused to stop things like data sharing, which means that if someone does access healthcare in a few months' time, the government could use that as a reason against them in their migration case. And also you have the additional problem that if someone thinks they've got coronavirus and they come forward for it and then they need treatment, but it turns out they don't have coronavirus, they're still liable for charging, which means that people are just really concerned that they're either going to get a huge fee or get deported from the country, which is obviously bad for the health of an individual, but it's also bad for public health in general. And we do know of cases of people who've died at home because they were too scared to access healthcare. So for us, there's sort of no question that scrapping the hostile environment is the current priority. And I think it sort of fits into this conversation about how we think about rebuilding our society in a way that sort of recognises people as people. We have to ensure that everyone has access to public services, regardless of whether or not you have the right piece of paper. And I think that that's something that the public should be able to get on board with now if we bring them with us in the right way, because I think we've got a sort of new public, which is like a public that can understand that if you can't work and can't access support services, that can be the difference between life and death. The conversations about furlough and not being able to work and when people can go back to work has sort of changed in public consciousness what support means for people. So I think there's lots of room for us to work on that. And at the same time, there's also an emerging public consensus about the way that we define work and value work, and the way we currently do it doesn't fit in with the real experiences of people during this crisis. I think there is broad recognition that key workers are keeping the public afloat, and they are made up almost entirely of people that the government determines to be low skilled, and many of which are migrants themselves or come from migrant backgrounds. So we know that there is a high migrant workforce amongst cleaners, taxi drivers, delivery drivers, nurses, carers, plumbers, electricians, and even primary school teachers. That the list is huge. Like, those workforces are all reliant on migrant workers, and they would all fall victim to the current government agenda to introduce a points-based system by 2021. So that's a system which would mean that you have to achieve a certain amount of points before you're allowed to enter the country, and achieve a certain salary threshold, which most of those people would not achieve. And we've seen in the last 2 weeks, or in fact not even 2 weeks, in the last week, 2 U-turns based on the fact that the government has extremely harsh rules for key workers or low skilled migrants who are now recognised as key workers. We had the Bereavement Scheme, which had to change, and also the Nhs Surcharge, which had to change. And it's sort of bittersweet for us, I guess, because to be really honest, they were huge wins, which had huge public support. But they're really just the very tip of the iceberg on what needs to change for migrants in general, because you have this whole system underneath those things of high fees and a chaotic home office and bad policies, and the system is so much worse once you get to the real sort of detail of it. So what we have been thinking of doing at JCWI is we want to start looking at how we can call on the government to imagine migrant work differently. And I think where we would start this journey is to look at ensuring that all migrants are able to work legally, access union support, and have full protection from exploitative employers. Because as part of the hostile environment, if you are undocumented, you can't access work, it's criminalised. that puts you at a high risk of exploitative employers and means that you have no rights at any time, and particularly less so during a pandemic. And one of the things we've learned from other European countries who have achieved a lot for migrants during this time, so for example, Portugal and Ireland, have all managed to get really big, massive concessions from the government, much bigger than we have. And one of the things that we've learned from them is that the reason they've been able to do that is because the right to work isn't criminalised in the same way. And when you take away that criminalisation, you can make migrant communities really visible, because you don't have to have status to work legally in lots of countries, including the US. And when you have a visible migrant workforce, even if they're undocumented, they're able to participate, they're able to have democratic rights, and they're able to really come forward and tell their own stories and ask for the things they need, including being able to unionize, which is a key part of democracy. So I think we have to shift away from the narrative about what work is valuable and towards levelling up of rights for everyone. And I think this is where the conversation really fits into economic recovery and how we can build back a better economy and society after we've gone through such a horrendous thing together. And I think I'll maybe end there, because I can see there's loads of really good questions. But I think the starting point for all of this has to be that in terms of public health, we're only as protected as the least protected people in our society. So if you have groups of people who are vulnerable and exploited and can't access services and therefore have to work and put themselves at high risk, then you can't properly protect the public. So for us, there's a real sense that this could be the beginning of a conversation, a beginning of a new deal for migrants, where we have like new allies and a new public interest. And I think we have to be really bold and imaginative in what we demand. And maybe I'll just add, I found that poll really interesting at the beginning, and I think that the breakout sessions we'll have some really interesting conversations. And I just want to flag that I sort of share both sentiments about it being a really scary time as well as maybe a positive time, because we're already seeing the far right and right narratives look towards a narrative around border control instead of travel restriction, which is two very different things. Quarantining people who are traveling legally is like right and necessary and in with World Health Organization guidelines, but trying to fit it into the frame of border control and needing to close our borders and stop asylum seekers from getting here is just a way to shift the narrative away from what's needed for migrants and back onto blaming migrant communities for the pandemic. So that's definitely something that we would look out for. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I think questions would be really great, because I think this is a real opportunity to be bold and imaginative and creative in what we ask for. And I'd love to hear all your thoughts on that.
Fantastic, Minnie. Thank you so much for that, and really love the summary of it, really, of talking about being bold and talk of a new public and really kind of jumping on the opportunities that have come from this terrible crisis. So there's a couple of questions I've noticed that touch on the same kind of thing. It's about the surcharge for NHS migrant workers. And I suppose the questions seem to be reflecting on what does it say about the fact that it's taken so much effort just to get that from the government, despite all the public backlash, and how it's kind of feeding into this good and bad migrant rhetoric, almost in terms of, rather than thinking about migrants as people and members of our community, we value them by kind of like how useful they are to native born Brits, or however regressive elements might put that. So yeah, what's your take on kind of how much effort it's taken to get those concessions, and whether kind of getting those first concessions might be leading us in a direction of hopefully getting more concessions and leading things in the direction we'd like to see in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I have been really conflicted about the NHS surcharge, because this is something that we migrants' rights campaigners have been shouting from the rooftops about for years and years and years, and traditionally is one of the least talked about topics in terms of just general migration. You often struggle to get anyone to really care about the surcharge that migrants have paid for healthcare. And then all of a sudden, from nowhere, you had this like cohort of new people, including Piers Morgan, saying that this was an outrage. This is what I mean when I say we have new allies. And I think it happened so quickly that there wasn't really a lot of time to try and broaden that conversation out, and even call on Labour to be a bit more bold with what they were asking for, because Labour were obviously asking for people working in the NHS and for carers to be exempt from the surcharge. And actually the surcharge is just horrific in general, and if you support the principle of no one having to pay for free healthcare, then you shouldn't be asking anyone to pay the surcharge. It's not, the NHS isn't a contribution-based system. We don't ask newborn babies to have paid a certain amount of money before they are able to access healthcare. So we shouldn't be asking anyone to have to contribute above and beyond in order to access a human right, essentially. And I think where we were struggling was that you might have an NHS worker, for example, a cleaner, who falls under that category and no longer has to pay the surcharge. But what about their families? What about their friends? What about the other people who are working, for example, as a cleaner in a school? What's the fundamental difference between those people? Not very much. So we really welcomed the fact that there was huge public interest in that, and that the public really got on board with it. But I think we still have a lot of work to do to broaden that out. And I think there's still opportunity for that, because Labour were going to introduce an amendment to the immigration bill which called for that. And what happened was the government sensed that they would lose, and therefore just gave the concession very quickly, which means that actually now in the immigration bill, there's an opportunity to cancel the surcharge altogether if we campaign effectively on it, and if people like Labour get on board with cancelling that system in general.
Great stuff, thanks. We've just had a really interesting question come through from Paul, which is kind of talking about the broader culture in the Home Office and the attitudes towards migrants that seem to be behind things like the hostile environment. And he's asking whether devolution of rules about migration might be a way forward for that. I think maybe motivated by the fact that those particular institutional attitudes might not be the case in the devolved governments in the same way, or local governments. So that makes, for me, that brings up questions of the way that this fight has been fought in the United States, for example, where alternative sources of power and alternative governments have been really standing up and resisting the federal government. So do you think that there is any mileage in that, or do you think that we have to focus all our attention on changing those institutional cultures at the UK level?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the first part about culture slightly separately, I guess. So there are huge cultural problems in the Home Office. Obviously, I don't know how many of you followed the Windrow Scandal, but the Windrush Scandal really highlighted the impacts of the hostile environment on a certain group of people who did have every right to be in the country, but were sort of caught in this chaotic blob of policy. And what it really did show was the impact on people of colour as well. After the Windrush Scandal, the government commissioned this Windrush Lessons Learned review, which we actually, it was published right at the beginning of the pandemic and sort of got lost in the ether. And that report by Wendy Williams had a whole load of recommendations on the culture and behaviour and practices of the Home Office. In fact, it was quite narrowly confined to how the Home Office functions as an institution. And there were loads of recommendations in there that the government has sort of said, yeah, we'll have a look at it. But we need to keep up the pressure on them to really implement those recommendations in a lot of ways. And what the Windrow Scandal prompted was lots of conversations from lots of different people about how you could sort of rectify this cultural problem in the Home Office. And we saw lots of various recommendations, like removing migration from the Home Office and putting it into a separate department, or giving more devolved powers, essentially. And I think we came to the conclusion that devolution would be more difficult to manage in some ways, because how do individual governments decide exactly what they need from the migrant workforce, and how do you control movement? And actually that would sort of defeat the point about valuing migrants as people and not for what they can contribute. So we didn't necessarily come to like a clear, this is a definite no, but for us, what you would really need to do in order for devolution to happen in that way would be to really destructure the sort of Jenga-like Home Office policies and work out which one would be best for Scotland or Wales or whatever. And that process would inevitably change the culture anyway. So I think the first step would be to really try and get rid of all these terrible policies, take those down, and then if devolution is an option after that, that can be a conversation for later on. I guess the point I'm trying to say is the Home Office is such a blob of crazy policy that it would sort of be impossible to start with devolution, and it would have to come later.
Great, thanks. If anyone else has questions, do put them in the chat. There's still a bit of time left. I wanted to pull together a couple of comments that Nick has asked about this idea of a new public, and also something that's alluded to a bit by Monique in saying that, is this really kind of a unique moment in moving away from kind of small demands like the really important ones that you've already talked about, to really trying to change the narrative about this. So could you tell us a bit more about kind of how you're feeling about this new public that's been kind of transformed by this unprecedented experience, and how far you think those opportunities go in terms of really transforming the way that society thinks about things and the impact that we could have on the government as a result of that? Yeah,
I think it's really clear that people are viewing work really, really differently. And I think that's where this idea of a new public comes in, because most people have now been affected in some way by furlough and by all of these things. And I just think that people can really understand now what it means to not be able to work legally. Now, I'm not saying that that would be a really easy jump to make in terms of migrant work. And I think that there's a lot of conversations that need to happen that aren't currently happening. And that's where we really need to put in the work as campaigners to build out on that narrative. But I feel quite positive about it, because the conversations that happened last week, I feasibly could not imagine them happening in the next 5 years if the pandemic hadn't happened. You have really compelling arguments, for example, on the NHS surcharge. You have people who were born in the country who aren't British citizens because of their parents' rights, who have to pay the surcharge every 2.5 years. Like, that story in and of itself, you would think would make the public outraged, but it hasn't in the last 5 years. And so the fact that those conversations are happening, and the fact that there's a whole load of people who are now talking about migrants in a completely different way, is really powerful. I mean, you even have ex-immigration ministers who are coming forward and saying that they don't agree with the way that we define work. So Caroline Noakes, for example, who was immigration minister 2 years ago, she is now standing in front of the government saying, I don't think this is the right time for a new immigration system, and I think we've got loads of problems to fix. So I do see this as an opportunity to build on what the public is already feeling and sensing. And I think there's lots of stuff in there about what movement looks like, and how it feels when movement is restricted, and what it feels like to be separated from your family, and what it feels like to not be able to have full support from the government in a lot of ways. And I think those are the areas in which we can really, really build. We can really build on migrants' rights, and basically really make people see the value of people as people, and not just as, like, an economic thing that we need, or a target, or someone who should be stopped from entering.
Great, yeah, it feels like a potentially real step change and transformationary moment, doesn't it? Um, we had a bit of a chat before tonight about kind of what JCWI had been working on with the immigration bill, and you mentioned some of the kind of unexpected wins that happened. Could you tell us a bit more about the bereavement changes that you won, and if you haven't mentioned it already, kind of what surprised you about that, kind of where you felt why you felt that the government was giving in on those things at this time, because you've obviously spent a lot of time talking to government, getting people to write into their MPs and things like that. What felt different this time about that?
Yeah, so the bereavement scheme is quite a horrible thing to have had to work on, to be honest. Basically, if you're in the country on a work visa and your family is therefore allowed to be in the country because you have a work visa, if you were to die during the pandemic, what the government was saying was that if you've died and your family is here because you are here, your family no longer has the right to be here, and therefore they could be deported. Now, that is a really horrific policy, but that's the way in which the government really does treat migrants, and has treated migrants up until this point, as very disposable, and very much like, if you don't have the right piece of paper, you don't have any rights to be here at all. And I think what happened in the last week was that people really understood that there were migrants on the forefront of the crisis who were putting themselves at really high risk for the UK and for us as a country and a community. And the whole time they were doing that, they were thinking to themselves, if I die, my family is going to be completely screwed over. They won't get any support from the public. They could be liable for deportation, their lives uprooted. And yeah, it's quite an awful policy, but it really exemplifies the treatment of migrants. And there are lots of other policies which do really similar things, or treat people in the same way. So what I think was really interesting about this is that one of the reasons that this policy was changed and did so well was because one of the unions placed it really high up in their priorities for their workers. And there have sort of been traditionally problems with unions representing migrant workers properly. You know, there often have been unions who have perpetuated the notion that migrant workers take away from the British workforce. So it was really interesting to me that the union really came out strongly in favour of migrants in this instance, and made the sort of values-based approach. But the thing that I think about it is that, you know, you shouldn't have to die for your rights and your family's rights to be respected. And I think that's where we weren't quite able to take the conversation further, which was, you know, we're still asking people to sacrifice themselves in order to just have your basic level of rights. But I do think it was fascinating the way it came about, which is that actually the way it came about was quite behind the scenes in Parliament, which is that the Home Affairs Select Committee raised it in a private briefing with ministers and with Priti Patel, and the ministers sort of sensed that this was going to be a really big problem and a really big deal. And then it, you know, a few stories in the public, a few key people again coming out against it, and the Home Office realised that they had to U-turn on it. And what it makes me feel is that if only there was this level of public scrutiny on the rest of our immigration system, you know, in the last 3 years, the really basic bits of Home Office policy, which have come to the forefront because of public interest, have immediately caused a huge scandal. And there is layer after layer of scandal in the Home Office, and it's just sort of waiting for public attention. So that's where I think that if we are able to sort of really galvanise public attention and draw attention to those things that are really quite awful, that actually the public will understand that this is not acceptable for the UK in any sense.
Great. Can I ask one quick follow-up to that that's based on a comment that we have from Becca, which is that obviously things like the surcharge, in this current context, the just sheer inhumanity and injustice of it is immediately obvious to everyone, right? But there's layer upon layer of kind of pernicious things within the government's immigration regime, and you could spend all day talking about all the different examples of which it affects people. So have you or your organisation been thinking about, right, we've won that kind of big symbolic victory, how can we now start mentioning all these tiny bits, like the kind of finer points of the NHS charging regime, and how you can actually shine a light on the whole system and the fact that it's all inhumane, basically?
Yeah, I think for us, this is where it really comes down to the two main things that I mentioned when I was talking earlier. The thing about migrant work and criminalisation of work, and how migrant workers who are undocumented are treated. I think it is really, really important, and I guess knowing the detail is also why it seems really important to me. But in other countries, where you have a visible migrant workforce or visible migrant populations that are able to come forward and speak about their own lives in a way that isn't criminalized, because here the hostile environment is so bad that you push all of these communities underground in a way that just doesn't happen in other countries. Even in Ireland, you know, they have similar data sharing and similar sort of criminalization in policy terms, but it is never enforced in the same way, which means they're able to get more rights for people when they're able to be visible and speak out. So for us, that's a real priority. And the other thing about getting rid of the hostile environment also has to go in hand with calling for sort of new ways for people to document themselves, because currently there are very restrictive routes to regularization. So let's say you've been undocumented here, for a really long time, whether that's because you've been denied a status by the Home Office and have nowhere to go, or whether that's because you've never applied for one. You know, you can have to have been here for 20 years before you're able to even apply for a new status. So trying to restructure that system is another priority area for us. And I think a lot of what it comes down to is strategy. And I know that this is the thing that we're not always so great at in like progressive communities, or even within the migrants' rights movement, is thinking strategically about how we ask for things. And I guess for us, what we are sort of thinking is, how can we, you know, we could call for a whole load of things right now that have no relevance necessarily in the public consciousness to the pandemic, which is why we've sort of chosen the work and the hostile environment angle, because we think those are the two things that people can really understand. You know, we could go off on one about a declaratory status for EU nationals, which no one really understands in this context. Or, you know, we could start talking more comprehensively about the deportation regime, which wouldn't make sense because deportations have been limited in this time. And we could also talk really heavily about things like raids. And again, those are all really low level during the pandemic. So to some extent, we have to talk about things that are really relevant. And those are the two things that I think would really, really make a fundamental difference, not only to this current situation, but in the long term. So if you really try and get rid of the hostile environment through whatever strategy you can, then that would allow people to come forward, to access services, to make sure they're in safe housing. You know, those are really fundamental things. And on that strategy, obviously, I mentioned that we've taken the government to court. There are lots of legal challenges ongoing at the moment on various different bits of immigration policy. Detention Action, which is a detention organisation, they've got a legal challenge against the government at the moment about indefinite detention. There are potential legal challenges on the NHS charging and access to healthcare. There are also various public inquiries about the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on BME communities, and how migrant communities fit into that. So there are lots of different avenues and strategies for how you bring this conversation to the forefront. And I think the sort of economic recovery conversations too, you know, you have lots of people talking about New Deals or Green New Deal or Build Back Better, and actually even we need to do some work to make sure they encompass migrants' rights too. So yeah, there's lots of work to do, and I think we have been thinking really carefully about which bits are the most relevant and which would make the most significant impact, and then I guess it's up to us to do all of the work to get there.
Absolutely. Really nice segue there to what we're going to do next. Thanks so much, Minnie. Really found that insightful, as I'm sure everyone else did. So what we're about to do now is to move into our breakout group session. And this is where we put you into small groups where you talk about the implications of Minnie's talk, what struck you the most about it, and what you think might need to change about our democracy to really push society in the direction of justice for migrant communities. So when you arrive in your room, please work amongst yourselves to appoint a facilitator that will try their best to make sure that everyone gets their say and might volunteer themselves when we come back together towards the end of the event to offer a summary of what your group talked about. So just to stress again, please treat people with the same respect that you would in everyday life, as we've gone over at the beginning of the call. So before we do that, I'm just going to give you a couple of questions to focus your conversation, which is, what were you most struck by Minnie's talk? Some of you might be familiar with some of the elements of the hostile environment, but there might have been other things that she mentioned that were completely new to you and might have changed your opinion about certain things. And the second one is, how could we change our democracy so that migrants' voices are better heard? We could think of that in terms of, what is citizenship if it means that you can't vote and be part of the people that forms a democracy? Do we need to change the model of citizenship in this country in order to do that? Or are there other ways that we need to talk about to achieve that goal? So in a few moments time, I'll split you up into your groups. Please appoint a facilitator and start to discuss those questions. You'll have a timer come up on your screen when there's 2 minutes to go before you're brought back together. So be sure to summarize your conversations before then. So I will do that any moment now. Okay, welcome back everyone. We're just waiting a few seconds whilst we get everyone in the same place again. Fabulous. Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed their conversations and that they were fruitful and people learned something from each other. I want to take a few volunteers now to very quickly, in kind of less than a minute or so, summarize the kind of discussion that you had. So could you please use the raise hand function if you want to volunteer to feedback? You can find that feature on the participants tab within your Zoom app. I have Dash, so I'm going to unmute you, Dash. There we go.
Lovely. Hiya. We had a fairly well, it was robust but fairly depressing discussion around undocumented and undocumented migrants and how they kind of go from documented to undocumented. The kind of lack of access to healthcare. We had a personal story around that. I guess to summarize quickly, I think we're trying to go around humanizing stories and trying to make those effective to it, because if we just kind of talk around economic contributions and things, like we've seen how that story's gone, to be honest. And if there is another kind of recession, austerity, we can't repeat the same mistakes that we kind of did that time in losing a lot of the rights that we had. And perhaps there's a lot to learn from the way the Windrush was documented and the work that was done by journalists at the time around documenting stories and making them central. And hopefully, I mean, I hate to say it, but hopefully there's a lot from this crisis that we can kind of document well and make central to our fights coming up.
Great, thanks so much, Dash. That's great. I'm going to go to Hesham now. I'm going to unmute you.
Cool. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.
Hi.
And yeah, thank you very much, Minnie, for your thoughts as well. So I'm going to try to briefly summarize some of the discussion that we had. So the first thing that we all noted, actually, and we all noted it independently, but we really appreciated the optimism and positivity and boldness of what Minnie was saying, which I think for many of us is really reassuring, because if we don't take as a starting point that people's perceptions are there to be shifted, that their views are malleable, then, you know, it kind of begs the question, what's the point? But I think anecdotally for me, I've definitely seen a lot of people that I work with, that I interact with, that I engage with, have really changed their perceptions more in the last, you know, 6 weeks than they have in the 6 years prior to that. So we kind of really follow that boldness and that positivity as well. Some of the specific things that that we kind of touched on were things about, you know, following on from what Minnie said, was about the right to work. Now that we're having a lot of questions about the economy, how the economy is comprised, how the economy is going to be rebuilt, you know, the right to work then fits into a really good narrative about the right to that recovery and sharing in that recovery, and the right to a contribution. It's a very good kind of narrative. It does come with a bit of a risk because, you know, after the global financial crisis as well, the whole idea of like high unemployment, limited amount of jobs, who's going to get those jobs, really, obviously, it's a bit of a minefield. But nonetheless, if we can learn from the mistakes that we made there and you know, try to avoid things like British jobs for British workers and everything along those lines, and actually kind of point to some of the examples that we're seeing at the moment, then I think that actually it could be a really positive argument around not just a bold new deal for migrants, but how migrants can help to power that recovery as well. So we saw some optimism there. We said that there could be some successes to be found in trying to leverage some of the really positive voices that we've seen in the last kind of couple of months. So people like Piers Morgan or Deborah Mead, and you know, these are like wide personalities that have kind of, you know, reach beyond traditional kind of sectors that are involved in things like migrant rights. Maybe an appeal to kind of them to try to continue their work beyond kind of COVID could be something that's interesting, and something that would work and kind of really just refresh who's kind of on the airwaves talking about some of these issues, and the coronavirus pandemic gives us an opportunity to try to do that. We came up with a couple of final points on democracy, just in response to the question on that. Personally, I think that the question of the franchise remains as fundamental as ever, and we need to address it almost as though we were trying to win the vote for the very first time, because for certain demographics, we are trying to win the vote for the very first time. Some people made comments about kind of protesting on a mass scale, but doing it as a series. Personally, actually, I think that the fact that we can't go out and protest might actually be a bit of an inadvertent positive thing, because some of the time you go and you protest and you feel a sense of achievement and outlet, and then you kind of stop there. So maybe there's something to be said there. And then very, very finally, we talked about the need to, two very final points, apologies for going on, but one of them was a suggestion to set up a select committee on migrant rights within the House. It's a select committee that would obviously kind of find a bit more pertinence today, but then could hopefully kind of live on beyond the coronavirus pandemic. And the second thing on democracy that was suggested was maybe kind of joining forces with a lot of the really great mutual aid support groups that have been set up, and working with them to try to put forward some council motions in support of migrant rights. And if you can get a significant enough groundswell of those, 200, 250 council motions at the local level would be very, very difficult to ignore. And the final point was we need more organizations like JCWI.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that positivity. And I really loved what you said about acting as if we're trying to win the vote for the first time. That's a really inspiring message, isn't it? I'm going to take a final contribution from Lauren Starkey before we move things towards the end. So I'm unmuting you now, Lauren. There we go.
Yeah, our group sort of had a discussion over a few things. Partly was the issue of devolution, and some of the positives and negatives around that. So positively, obviously, it decentralizes power and kind of takes the wind out of the Home Office's sails. But at the same time, there are issues around the inequalities of support and decision making and access. So an example I was saying could be, you know, if you're an asylum seeker who arrives in Kent and your decision is therefore processed and made by Kent, well, what if you find out that Surrey has a more permissive, a kinder kind of system or decision makers, and then, you know, are you more likely to benefit from the system if you're first discovered in Surrey than you are if you're discovered in Kent, and kind of how do you address those potential inequalities? We talked more broadly about kind of how to change how our democracy works worldwide, how to cut what different organisations and solutions there are. So one of our group members, he's posted a couple of links in the comments to an organisation that he's working with that is looking at alternative forms of democracy and how we can move that along. And finally, an issue that's really, really important to me was that part of the way that the NHS surcharge issue really seemed to cut through recently was that because of our current situation, it's quite a tangible thing. We're seeing doctors and nurses on the front lines saving people's lives. Therefore, it was possible to cut through to the public and say, look, these people who are saving our lives, these are their stories, and this is what they're experiencing. And that provided a really unique opportunity to push through an agenda and policy change in a way that benefited those groups. And on the one hand, that's really positive, and it had me thinking about the power of individual stories to lead to systemic change. The downfall of that for me, for example, my job is specialising in working with trafficked children. This is a group of children whose stories they don't want to be told, and they never will be. There are so many safeguarding issues. There is so much that prevents trafficked children from really viscerally telling a story. So do we risk moving towards a situation where some groups who are more able to tell their stories are able to have their rights and the agenda that supports them best pushed through, while others end up being left behind?
Thanks so much, Lauren. Again, it's really powerful. I think we're running out of time, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do now is to hand back over to Minnie for any final reflections on the points that you've all made before we bring things to a close. So let's just get you unmuted again, Minnie. There we are.
Thanks. Yeah, there were some really interesting comments there. I think I really liked what Hesham was saying about, ownership of the recovery and who recovery belongs to. I think that's definitely something that I'm going to reflect on about how we can communicate that better. Again, about having a select committee, I am not fussed if that's something that's useful. It could be useful. There are various select committees that should have responsibility for equalities and for migrants, and actually do so quite well. The Home Affairs Select Committee is quite good. Can't really fault them for the way that they sort of skewer the Home Office quite regularly. Noticed that someone also put a comment about engaging with the APPG ramp, which is we do that also regularly, and I encourage people to look at the stuff that the APPG on migration, APPG on race, and other various APPGs do to encompass migrants' rights. And in terms of stories, yeah, like this is always an issue, and I think it really highlights the reason why you have to ask for rights for people in order for them to be able to tell the story in the way they want to tell it. And I think the thing that really does unite lots of different kinds of undocumented people, obviously trafficking victims have a very specific, a very specific situation, which isn't necessarily always the right way to go in terms of public stories. But I think the big problem we have is that we don't allow people to talk about the things they want to talk about because they can't talk about them. So in some ways, allowing them to be in a situation where they can lead that conversation. And I would actually really encourage people to look at the work that Migrants' Rights Centre Ireland have done and the Portuguese government have done, because, they had a big campaign to put people to basically call for a new type of status for a certain group of people, and that came out of workers already having some rights, and what they ended up calling for was new rights for student overstayers, so people who'd overstayed their student visas and therefore didn't have a right to be in the country. And they had a whole bunch of people being able to talk about their own rights themselves and talk about what they wanted to talk about. And to some extent that already happens in the UK. Like, asylum seeker stories are really prevalent and really common, as they rightly should be. You have far less prevalence of stories for people who have perhaps entered in a way that isn't considered legal, or even people who have lost their status and been here illegally for a really long time, illegally. those kind of people just aren't able to come forward. So yeah, I think we just have to start somewhere. And also I think we should be way more creative with how we tell those stories. Working on the Windrush campaign was like really interesting, and there was huge public support for those kinds of people because they were considered British, and in some way it was easy for them to talk about what they had experienced. But the thing that was really interesting to me about it was we suddenly had a new way of telling a story and a new way of journalists being involved. They haven't been involved in that kind of way for, like, I don't know, whether ever. But I think, we can be more creative, and we can think more about like alternative storytelling as well. I'm a really big fan of fiction and poetry and theatre and art, and I think all of that is at risk currently because of the pandemic, but is a really interesting way to tell the stories of other people and to tell your own story yourself in a creative format. So storytelling, amazing and really, really important, and really welcome any ideas for how we can do those things differently.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Minnie. I found the discussion so uplifting and thought-provoking, and I hope everyone else has as well. So thank you so much for your time tonight. Just to close then, I just wanted to outline how, it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase now to say that there's no going back to normal. Whatever happens after the pandemic is going to be different to what we had before. But this is almost even more the case when we think about our democracy and who has power, because even before this all kicked off, the government had plans to re-engineer our democracy in ways that would have practically handed more power to a minority of people, more so than has often been the case. But that's already on the cards for a post-pandemic society. So one of the government's briefing documents about their recovery plan is talking about a rapid re-engineering of government structures to cope with the implications of the post-pandemic society. So I just want to make clear that it's up to all of us to think about what we can do right now to put forward this alternative vision of what democracy could be like in the future, so that it's not made for us. So what is the route out of lockdown going to be? Is it going to take power away from communities even more, and are migrant communities going to be even more voiceless? Or is it there going to be a new system that is more participatory, more engaging than something that we've been living under? And that's down to what all of us do now. And the public has to demand more democracy. That's something that we want to work on together. And if you look at our own history, nothing has ever been granted to us because the elites wanted to do that. It's been won by trade union movements, it's been won by migrant communities, it's been won by feminist movements demanding the vote and demanding their rights. And that is something we should be thinking about now in terms of how we shift the situation and really re-engineer our democracy so that it's the people that have more power than has been the case before. So please find out more about our campaign. If you're not on our email list already, please sign up to that. Trudy should be posting the link in the chat for that. And I want to, before we go, just say that there's a couple more sessions on the sorts of big issues over the next couple of evenings, but on Friday, we're going to be talking about the future of democracy and what democracy after lockdown could look like. We'll be having two fantastic speakers, Hilary Wainwright, who is one of the editors of Red Pepper magazine, and someone who has really done a lot of research on things like participatory budgeting and lots of experiments, particularly in Latin America, of how democracy can be done at a more grassroots level and not just be about who has power at the centre. And we'll also be hearing from Christine Berry, who wrote a book on how a radical government could actually change the structures of the state so that ordinary people have more power as part of that. So we really be digging into the solutions that already exist out there and how we can work together to try and make that part of the post-pandemic future. So this is a big project. It's not down to one individual or one organization, but it's about kind of working together on coming up with a common blueprint that's going to push democracy in a positive direction and not a regressive direction. So please sign up to our email list. If you're representing an organization, please get in touch with us. Our contact details are on our website. We'd love to talk to you more about that. So just to sum up finally then, there's going to be a survey emailed to you through Eventbrite in a few minutes time. Please fill that out. Trudy should be posting that in the chat as well. And thank you again, Minnie. I can't wait to hear people's feedback in the survey. If you want to keep the conversation going, you can use the hashtag #democracygathering on Twitter. but that's good night from us for now, and I hope to see you all at some of the subsequent sessions in the coming week. Thank you so much. Good night.